Hello, my name is Gabrielle Johnson, and my presentation today is on dengue fever. Dengue is a mosquito-transmitted vector-borne disease. It's often transmitted by either Aedes aegypti or A. albopicus, which can be identified by the white stripes on the legs, as can be seen in the picture to the left. Currently, no cure exists for dengue, and there are 4 serotypes making it possible to contract this disease multiple times. A vaccine is available, but it has a very low efficacy and is ineffective against several types of serotypes, including native infections, which is the very first time a person is infected by dengue. Dengue is dubbed breakbone fever by some countries, and this is due to its most common symptom of bone and joint pain, as well as fever in more mild cases, which can become internal bleeding, shock, and sometimes even death in more severe cases. According to the CDC and the World Health Organization, the incidence of dengue has significantly risen in the past decade. According to the CDC, dengue is present now in over 100 countries, which make up 40% of the world's population. They also found that 100 million people will be ill from dengue in a year, and of those, 22,000 people may die from severe dengue. Dengue is prevalent in tropical and subtropical areas, specifically those in Latin American and Asian countries. As you can see from this map, anywhere warm and tropical or subtropical is at risk for dengue because these are places where mosquitoes are very likely to occur. The paper I chose to look into for this presentation is titled Spatial Analysis of Dengue Seroprevalence and Modeling of Transmission Risk Factors in Dengue Hyperendemic Cities of Venezuela. This was published in Travel Magazine and Infectious Disease Journal a few years ago. The objective of this study was to locate hotspots and associate these hotspots with factors that may contribute to these rates. They divided their factors into 4 subcategories: demographics, socioeconomic factors, environmental and household factors, and mosquito preventative measures. The demographics data included age, sex, and occupation, which mostly fell underneath the population vertex. The socioeconomic factors took into account their type of housing, crowding, bedrooms, employment status, as well as duration of residence, which can be divided between the habitat and behavioral vectors. The habitat vertex is taken into account when looking at the environmental and house factors, which include water storage situation, public service availability, mosquito breeding sites, and potential water reservoirs where mosquitoes may lay their eggs, such as water bases and used tires. In addition, they looked into the mosquito preventative measures, which all fall under behavioral. These include the presence of nets, windows, and repellents used. This paper was heavily influenced by another paper that was done in conjunction with this. It was also studying Maracay, Venezuela, and it was an extended cohort study. This paper, on the other hand, is a preliminary case control study that was later used in the cohort study mentioned. The case control study was done in conjunction with spatial analysis, in which hotspots were identified using GIS, which I will explain later. The area of study chosen was the capital of Venezuela, Maracay, specifically 3 neighborhoods within the capital. These were identified using previous research. As you can see, 2 of them are clustered in the same area and 1 is on the other side of the city. However, all of these in preliminary testing showed a very high prevalence of dengue fever. The way they collected their data was first by identifying households in the neighborhoods to survey. They started with the survey to all of the household members and then supplemented that with a survey done by the researchers of the environmental factors surrounding their homes. This was used to minimize any survey bias in their data. In addition, they did a blood test on all the participants in each household in order to identify the seroprevalence and later map the hotspots used to do their case control study. GIS in this study was used to identify hotspot households and blocks within these neighborhoods that had a high seroprevalence, which is defined as a high portion of the unit with a positive result for past dengue infections. As you can see above, these two pictures represent the amount of people with past dengue infections, the dark areas being 36 to 50% seroprevalence. These are all combined and had been stacked, as in every past dengue infection on a living person is counted here. As you can see, this isn't very meaningful data, and so the researchers decided to look into more recent dengue infections to get more meaningful results. This slide represents more recent dengue infections. As can be seen, these darker areas again represent blocks with a 36 to 50% seroprevalence. The blue circles represent blocks that had a high seroprevalence and were considered hotspots, while the red dots represent households that were considered hotspots. Their results found that 36 people lived in these hotspot households, while 144 people lived in hotspot blocks. This data was then used to conduct an odds ratio. This was different in that instead of their odds ratio being against if someone did or did not have dengue, they were testing against if they did or did not live in a hotspot identified in the previous slides. As you can see, age had very little difference, with a slight increase for the age group of 21 to 30-year-olds, likely due to these people having jobs. Gender saw very little difference, and occupation saw a large difference, with housewives, merchants, and employees/office workers having a much higher prevalence. The odds ratio associated with housewives and domestic workers was 5.08, while merchants, employees, and office workers was 3.27. As they saw a large odds ratio for housewives and domestic workers, they looked into this as a binary factor, in which they found that those who were working in domestic/household occupations had a 2.85 odds ratio versus those who did not. The next they looked into was the socioeconomic factors. These included the type of house, bedrooms, etc. What they found was that shacks were at a much greater risk than other types of households, such as houses and apartments, which had an odds ratio of 13.51 times more likely to be in a hotspot block than those who lived in other types of housing. Those within a household that had 5 or more bedrooms were at less risk. People who were in a home with more than 7 people were at less risk, and those who worked were at more risk, while those who were studying were at less risk. The next factor they looked into was environmental and household risk factors. They found that having general water storage in the home was 5.62 times more likely to live in a hotspot area than households that did not. In addition to this, they found that when those water storage areas were in tanks or containers, they were at more risk, with containers having 2 times more risk than those who did not. In addition, they found that accessibility to public services showed less risk, while households with litter, used tires, and other potential water reservoirs where mosquitoes could potentially lay eggs had a greater risk than those households that did not. Next, they looked at the mosquito preventative measures. What they found was that screened windows had the same amount of risk, while nets on beds had half the amount of risk as those who did not. The use of insecticides and repellents showed more risk, with as much as twice the risk in the case of repellents. Container washing halved the risk. The researchers concluded that the use of spatial analysis of seroprevalence data is useful for risk identification for diseases like dengue and has its advantages over survey methods that rely on symptoms. This is because survey methods increase the bias in the paper, while seroprevalence data may take into account those who may have had dengue and not been symptomatic. In addition, they found that clustering of hotspots are on a small scale of 20 to 110 meters, which was significantly smaller than the researchers had anticipated. Also, they learned that poverty-related factors are important for understanding dengue distribution in Venezuela, and their recommendations are that the government allocate its resources to these areas to help prevent the spread of dengue in the future. Some limitations are that this paper had survey and volunteer bias, but it was minimized. Some of the households they chose to do their survey on did not want to participate, increasing the volunteer bias. In addition, it only took into account living citizens, which does not take into account those who may have died recently from severe dengue infections, and it is limited by this. This has been my presentation. Thank you for your time.